Hello, people. Hello, people often say, when am I going to do another history, government, politics video? And I say, well, I don't do them just to make them. I think if something gets in my mind and I want to talk about it or present it, then I'll make a video. I don't just do it just as a routine thing. But I was thinking about something, the last few days, and they keep talking about it. I thought it would kind of go away, but it has kind of gone away. But this camera drives me nuts. Um, there was Nikki Haley. Say what you want about her, but she's running for president in the Republican Party and against President Trump, who's likely to get the nomination as we speak, February 2024. But you never know; these things can change. But they ask questions about. They ask, obviously, the news media ask questions to these candidates to try to catch them. What they call gotcha questions. So they're asking about the so-called Civil War, which it wasn't a civil war. A civil war is when two factions are trying to overthrow the same government. But in that case, that was a war between 11 states that were trying to leave a country and make their own country. It was a war of secession, like the war in 1775 to 1783, the one that we have a holiday for, the Revolutionary War. I'm drinking juicy IPA from Sierra Nevada. I'm not really thrilled with it. I wouldn't buy it again. I wouldn't buy it again, but I bought it. It's exactly what I expected. I didn't expect much. I expected a little bit of enjoyment, and I got a little bit of enjoyment. But beyond that, hear sirens. So they asked her, Nikki, and I'm always watching this stuff about politics, and I say to myself, like, you need me as an advisor, because you got bad advice. Like, so they asked her, what this has nothing to do with the current state of affairs, really, but they say, ask her, what was the cause of the, what was the cause of the Civil War? Like she's a historian. She's not running for a historian. She's running for president. Now, her best answer would have been, hey, look, I don't really know a lot about that. And so I don't feel comfortable answering questions about an event from over 150 years ago. I really don't know. Honest, right? She could have been honest. I really don't know. You have to ask a historian. Don't ask me medical questions. I'm not a doctor. But these people run for president, so they got to know everything, or they think they have to act like they know everything, right? They have an answer for everything. She talks about it was a disagreement about the rights of the people versus the national government, federal government, whatever, some garbled answer or something like that. So then, there was a firestorm on the media. They were saying, she didn't talk about slavery. Every respectable person knows slavery was the reason for the war and blah, blah, blah. And then she tried to walk it back and saying, well, when I was growing up, I had many black friends. It's like she made it worse, and they say, what? And it's like having black friends has nothing to do with the fact that you didn't know the cause of the war. But she's a weak candidate. And when you're a weak candidate, you give weak answers. I mean, no knock against her. I have no personal animosity against Nimrata Haley. All right. I don't have personal animosity against Joe Biden. Honestly, it's not a personal thing. It's not personal, Tom. It's strictly business. You know what I mean? It's a policy problem. But so then there was Trump, Donald Trump. They were saying he was talking. He talks all the time. He talks more than me. So he was saying, the war could have been negotiated. In other words, the war between the states, the so-called Civil War, as they call it, could have been prevented through negotiation. And so the media went berserk. That guy, he's so evil. And they were laughing it off, how could you negotiate? And then you had the pompous people saying, there is no negotiation with slavery. And I was like, I would have said, what are you talking about? So the people that were pompous and doing, trying to position themselves as the higher moral authority or whatever, they were saying, there's no negotiation with slavery. I don't know what they're talking about. And it's funny because they were ripping on him. They were ripping on Trump for saying there could have been negotiations when the man that they all love and adore, Lincoln, was trying to negotiate it in 1860 and 61. So that's what I felt was so comical. They were ripping on Trump for saying that the war could have been prevented. And my alternative channel is, keep this in mind, my alternative channel is called Anti-War. All right, so this whole channel and the alternative channel is an anti-war focus. So you have to take that into account. Like the whole approach is the anti-war movement. So here's the media, the controlled media. You know what I mean? They're saying, that guy is evil because he said that the war could have been prevented through negotiation. But yet the man they love, Lincoln, who is notorious in so many ways, wanted to prevent the war through negotiation. So it shows their level of incompetence to talk about the cause of the war. And I got a kick out of that, because here's a guy that was saying, born in Kentucky, by the way, but grew up in Illinois, saying, I would take the Union with all the slaves enslaved. I'm not saying a direct quote. I'm just referring to the quote. I'll take the Union with none of the slaves enslaved. I'll take the Union with all of the people remaining in slavery. I'll take the Union with all the people let go. Or what do you say? I'll take the Union with half the people freed and half the slaves, remaining slaves. So in other words, he was saying his goal was to maintain the United States. That was his point. Irrelevant about slavery. Now, was slavery a big part of the reason? The answer is yes and no. Yes and no. You can't say, you got these two sides, like left wing will say it was the only reason, right? Right wing will say it was none of the reason. But the answer is it was yes and no. It was and it was not. Okay, so you have to look at it in that more measured. Of course, it would take intelligence to do that. But Trump, who doesn't profess to know much about history, but he does have some minimal understanding of it. But he was being castigated and attacked for saying that the war could have been prevented through negotiation, which is certainly true. And at the same time, the man they celebrate, like I said earlier in the video, Lincoln, is a guy who tried to prevent the war through negotiation. And remember, he proposed a constitutional, or he endorsed an idea for a constitutional amendment, which would make slavery permanent. It would be a constitutional amendment that would make slavery permanent forever in the United States if the Confederate States would come back to the United States. That was his negotiating point, saying, well, how about this amendment where slavery would be permanent in the southern states forever if you come back? Now, do you hear that on the on the news media? Of course you don't. And people will talk about the Emancipation Proclamation. Well, we know about the Emancipation Proclamation. We're well aware of it, which was declared in 1862, but actually went into effect, so-called in effect, 1861, January 1st, 1863. I mean, what am I saying? 1863. But that was just after a bunch of bad defeats on the U.S. side, because when they invaded the South, they were expecting a pretty fast victory. And so then they went and then they had these terrible defeats. And then it was looking like, well, we might not win this, So being like Hillary Clinton said, being a pragmatist, he decided, well, if I can't beat the armies, I'll make war on the civilian population. So he put that proclamation out in really as an attempt to encourage an uprising in the South, which didn't work, by the way, since it didn't have any. Much like King George III was accused by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence, which most people will celebrate today, he accused King George III of trying to foment or encourage us, what did Jefferson call a servile insurrection, meaning a slave uprising. Because what did King George say? Any slave who fights for the British Empire, when the war ends in victory for the British, will get freedom. But that went nowhere, because if slaves did hear about it, they didn't believe it and thought it was a trick. But the real reason was 99% never heard about it, never heard the proclamation. They didn't tend to read the newspaper, so they weren't really aware of that offer. But so let's go back to what Nikki Haley was saying, that it was about the government's relationship with the people. Well, we know that. So that there was a controversy, as they say, but starting all the way back to 1781, because they say, well, in the North, they say, well, it's the Union that's the ruler. It's the central government, basically. We'll try to keep this simple. And then in the South, they say, no, it's the states that created the Union. So they have the ultimate authority, because remember, we broke away, we seceded, right? We seceded from Great Britain in 1783 after it was ratified. Great Britain recognized it and the war was called off. And we, the people, meaning we, the states, created the Union. The states created the Union. They had to ratify. Well, anybody would accept that. They had to ratify the agreement, the Constitution, which they did. We built the cake. You know what I mean? We built the wedding cake. And now we've decided later that we don't like the cake, so we're going to unbuild it. So that was the whole. Haley was right about that. The states created the Union, the Federation. And then later, down the road, some of the states decided, yeah, we're not really happy being part of this Union. So guess what? We're going to repeal our ratification of it, which is what South Carolina did. 1860, they said back in 1787 or 88, the date's not important. That's a reference material. We ratified this new union. And some states did it with the stipulation that they could recall it at any time, by the way. So they said, okay, well, we're going to unratify it. We're repealing. We did it voluntarily, so we're going to repeal it voluntarily. And we're out. No hard feelings, but we're leaving, and we're the Republic of South Carolina. Thank you very much, and bye-bye. And then 10 other states followed. So she was right in that respect, but then she was wrong. Well, she wasn't wrong to admit slavery as a cause, but it was just her lack of knowledge about the events, because that certainly is part of it. Is that where the king cake came from? No, that's not where the king cake came from, William. So you can't, on the right wing of the argument, on the right wing here, they'll say it wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights and whatever they say. But that's really incorrect. No, it was about slavery in conjunction with states' rights and all the other things. See, because on the left, now, of course, on the left wing of the argument. They'll say it was only about slavery. And I would ask those people, I'll say, what do you, now I would challenge those people. I say, what are you talking about? Do you understand what happened in 1860 or 1861? And I would ask them, can you explain that to me, the causes of this war, the so-called Civil War? And I think they believe, I hope they don't, but I think they believe that something happened along the lines of the United States government told the South, you have to get rid of slavery. And they said no. And so they had a war, which is clearly not what happened. And anyone who thinks that's what happened is woefully ignorant. So, but we go back to the roots, right? Now, this was a problem from the start. If you deny that, then you just don't want to entertain history. Fine, go ahead, live in a fantasy world with your Peter Pan advice. You know what I'm saying? So, but I'm not living in a fantasy world. Actually, I live in the real world. So, so we take a little trip back to 1775, or when the trouble started, in 1776, when they declared independence. There was not a problem at that time because the main focus was we have to beat Great Britain or all of our dreams and desires won't matter anyway, because they will come in, arrest us for treason, and we'll all be killed. Simple as that. But then France, the Kingdom of France and Spain jumped in and helped them, so they won. And you know, it's a long drawn out. We all know that story, or you should know the story. If you don't know the story, read about it. The Revolutionary War. It's interesting. All right, so they had the Articles of Confederation, and people said it wasn't a good constitution. I don't necessarily agree with that, but if you have a conspiratorial mindset, you'll believe that it was like a plot to undermine the Union of States and to make the federal. And that's what the Anti-Federalists said, by the way. Interestingly, the people that didn't want a new constitution were saying that it's a trick. It's a trick. They're trying to build an empire. Why do we break away from the British Empire if we're going to build a new empire? It's a trick. It's a trick. And then the Federalists said, no, 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 you're crazy. You know, you're just a bunch of conspiracy theorists. It's going to be a union of states. And they published a bunch of articles in the newspaper because they didn't have radio and television and internet back then, giving their arguments why they should have this new constitution, a federation instead of a confederation, stronger central government, which were collected and put into book form called the Federalist Papers. I have the Federalist Papers. I've read them all. They're very interesting. Most people that think they know everything and never read it, but they'll tell you all day long about everything. They'll tell you everything, boy. They'll tell you everything. Don't know nothing, but tell you everything. I say, you ever read the Federalist Papers? They've heard about it. All right. But I mean, you know, in the Federalist Papers, they're saying, oh, no, it's all lies. It's not going to be an empire. And it was a very good way to format the Federalist Papers because it was constructed as a question and answer series in the newspaper. Question, answer, question, answer. So they were taking like questions that they knew people were going to ask, or like attacks against the new government, and then they would give an answer, a response. So if you read the Federalist Papers, they say like, question, well, what if the U.S. government, this new government, passes a law that's unconstitutional or tyrannical, like in the British days, which they had recently come out of? The answer was, oh, well, you don't have to worry about that because they could just declare it null and void. You know, the state could refuse to recognize it. And people say, oh, yeah, okay, the state could just not accept it. Now, that sounds fine, but then now that you're thinking, well, wait a minute, what if that actually happens down the road? That could lead to real problems, in which, of course, it did. Nullification and intervention and nullification and all of that. So they were like problems that people were talking about that were potential problems, like They pass a law that's unconstitutional. What do you do about it? You know what I mean? Like, and the answer from the pro Constitution was, well, you could override it through state intervention. And so then later down the line, in the 1830s, right, South Carolina is saying, we don't like this tariff law. We're going to declare it null and void. And that led to a near war between the states in 1833, but it wasn't quite time yet. But that was a close call there. So there were some structural issues with the Constitution from the start, which when they created Canada in 1867, the British were, see, the British, you know, the British Empire, whatever you want to say about them, bad or good. You could say a lot bad and good, but you know what I mean? No, I mean, they were watching that whole scenario and they were saying, oh, we don't want that to develop. This conflict between the colonies, the provinces, and the national government in Ottawa and ultimately in London. So what they did was they created a constitution where they did it backwards from the US Constitution. And they said, here's the powers that the provinces have. You know, it's a handful. All the other powers are with the central government, the crown, the Queen Victoria, meaning the Parliament in London, and all, you know, later on as they transferred Canada into an independent country by 1982, when it got its own, when the British government gave them their own constitution. But you see what I'm saying? So they said, okay, here's what the provinces can do. And all the other powers reside with the central government in London and Ottawa and the crown. So there was no real argument about that. But in the United States, it was like backwards or frontwards from that start. And they were saying, here's the powers of the US government. And any other power that they don't have is reserved for the states and the people. And they even put that in the Bill of Rights, the 10th Amendment. Of course, the Federalists said the Bill of Rights is dangerous. I talked about that in a previous video. The Federalists said the Bill of Rights is dangerous. You shouldn't have a Bill of Rights. And the Anti-Federalists didn't seem to understand. And I agree with the Federalists because John Jay, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, they were saying, well, wait a minute. You're saying we need a Bill of Rights saying that the federal government can't do these things. Congress shall make no law establishing a religion. Congress shall not abridge freedom of speech, so forth. But what Thomas Jefferson and Madison and John Jay were saying was, wait, they don't have that power anyway. Okay, they're saying you're claiming or you're contending that we need a Bill of Rights to prevent the U.S. government from abridging the freedom of speech when they don't have the ability to abridge the freedom of speech from the start. So what you're implying, you know, so they were very smart. They said by making a Bill of Rights, you're implying that they somehow have that power. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. So the Federalists said, but when you say that, you're implying that they somehow have that power, which that was never delegated to them. That power was never delegated to the U.S. government. They didn't have that power from the start. So you don't need a law saying, okay, so this is what they're saying. You don't need a law, meaning the 10th Amendment, part of the framework, to say, so this is what they're saying. You don't need a law saying Congress shall not pass a law that prevents people from doing something that Congress has no power to prevent people from doing. You see what I mean? A double negative. A double negative is a positive. So they're saying it's a trap, essentially. You know, and Congress, the Second Amendment, Congress shall not, or it doesn't even say Congress, that the right to bear arms shall not be abridged. You see, but they said, but that's dangerous because you're implying that they have the right to abridge that ability when they don't have that right. It was never delegated. It's not a delegated power. The only powers that the U.S. government has are the one delegated to them from the states and the people. So I think the Federalists were onto something there. You don't need a law to prevent someone from doing what they have no power to do. Okay. So that was a problem. So you see the structural problems from 1787 onward to today. There's a structural fault. It's kind of like the HAL 9000. There was a fault in its design, and then it started to show up on the mission to Jupiter, or in the novel Saturn. See? So it went along, and then it started to collapse when the structural problem evidenced itself. Okay, so then that's what happened up until 1860. Now Nikki Haley doesn't have that knowledge, so she can't discuss it. I'm not attacking her, and I'm not putting her down or saying nasty things. I'm saying she can come on this channel and discuss this with me. I know she does not have that knowledge, okay? And she's not going to be able to discuss that. That's not going to happen. And it can't happen because she don't have the knowledge. But now people will say, well, she didn't talk about slavery. And so let's talk about that for a minute. So aside from the structural deficiencies that I just talked about, then we had the slavery issue. Now, in 1787, it was not necessarily a big issue, but they could see that it was a potential issue. Now, you see, even then, they could see that it was a potential problem, because they were kind of forward thinking. Like, they were like, okay, well, it's 1787, nobody really cares, but time marches on, and what's going to happen down the road? So they're like, okay, well, they had to address these problems. So they say, well, in the northern states where there's not a bunch of plantation industry, slavery isn't a real issue because it's not feasible there. Although many of those colonies in later states do allow slavery, but it's a paper issue. They allow it, but it doesn't exist except in a handful of instances. So it's not. But in the South, especially after the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney, and then other mass production technology, then plantation agriculture became so huge, mass production agriculture. So then slavery became much more of a thing that could become bigger, you see. So then you start having mass importation from Africa and all of this. So they're looking at that problem in 1787, like, it's like, this is what's happening. They're saying it doesn't look too good. So they want to stop importation of slavery, the slave trade. They knew they couldn't stop it overnight, so they compromised, right? They compromised. They said, well, okay, in the southern states, they knew it didn't really look too good either. So they said, okay, how about this? You can't outlaw that until 20 years after the thing is ratified. Okay, we'll give it 20 years to play out. And so 1788, it gets ratified. And then in 1808, boom, they outlaw the slave trade. No more importation of slaves into the United States. The Southerners say, we didn't care. It was a compromise. And they were bringing them in like by the droves in the 20-year period. Okay, so they say people reproduce, they have children, and they encourage a lot of children, so, but however you look at that, good or bad, I get that. So, but they could still see it's a problem. It is a problem. And they could see that down the road it's going to lead to problems. They're seeing this in 1787. Okay. I was reading about Rhodesia the other day. Rhodesia had this big flare up with Great Britain in 1965, and it drug on until 1979, 14 years. And it was like almost a war situation, kind of like we talk about the American Revolution. And they had this big argument over Black people voting in elections. And the Rhodesians said, we don't prevent Blacks from voting. And the British said, yes, you do. And they said, no, we don't. And it went on and on. But if you read the history, that went back to the 1920s. It wasn't something that just popped up. It had been going on for like 40 years. And in the 1920s, I was reading these reports that the British commissioners were making back to London. They were like, well, Rhodesia could be an independent or semi-independent country like Canada and Ireland and New Zealand and so forth, what they called dominions back then, in self-governing colonies, which today are independent, what they call Commonwealth realms. They're independent, but they have the king as their ruler, at least, on executive, but not the day-to-day ruler. You know what I'm saying? They have a prime minister to run the daily operations, like a store manager. The king is just on a picture on the wall. All right. But, and I was reading the report, they said, however, there is a problem with their racial legislation, their racial laws. And this is like in the 1920s, like the mid 1920s. So they were saying we could make them an independent dominion like Ireland, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, Newfoundland. But there's this racial law problem. So they had a problem with it back in the 1920s. And if you trace the history of Rhodesia, it just kept building. And the British were like, well, you might want to let the African people vote. And the Rhodesians said, we have no rule against that. And they were like, well, practically you do. And they were like, no, we don't. And it went on and on. And so this was like a problem they were looking at in 1787 with the slavery thing. All right, so let's look at a comment. KS says, if the soldiers on opposing sides during the war, so-called Civil War, could reconcile and not hold animosity towards one another, then why on earth do people today exhibit such hate toward long dead soldiers? For instance, tearing down statues. Oh, yeah, it's a good question. Well, they don't hate the soldiers and they don't hate the Confederacy. They hate you and me. And see, it's sort of like, well, if we can tear down that, then the next step, we're going to tear down Washington, Lincoln, FDR, take your pick, Woodrow Wilson. It's just like a gradual advancement. They'll say, well, FDR one time in 1927 said that. So see, it's like, it's not really about that. It's about getting away with some things now, and then later and then it'll be like, we're going to take down the flag. We hate the stars and stripes. We want a new flag. Maybe it'll be green, black, and red. You see black, green, and red, or red, black, and green. So it's not about what you're thinking it's about. It's about something bigger than that. All right, so back to the story. So she was saying it's not about slavery. But it was about slavery, but it was about how to tackle the issue. So if you go back to the Constitution, good point. They had the argument over representation. That we talked about that in a previous video. The southern states, obviously, they say, well, we need to count everyone in the South, because the more people you have in your state, the more people you get in Congress. You got more votes. We count everybody. And the northern states rightly said, well, wait a minute. You're going to count the slaves, except that they can't vote. In fact, they can't even run for office, and they don't even have any state rights. They have no rights. They're considered property. So how can you say they can be represented in the Congress? So they should get no representation. You count all the white people or the freed blacks who could technically vote in some sense. So, and the Southerners say, oh, no, we want to count everybody. Well, they wanted to make a constitution and a union, so they compromise. And that's the 3/5 compromise. Now, the modern socialist historians will say they looked at black people as 3/5 of a person. But that's not what that argument was about. It was nothing about looking at somebody as 3/5 of a person or 60%. It was arguing over how much representation they would have in the House of Representatives. So they compromised. They would count 100% of the whites and 60% of the slaves as part of their congressional calculation. Now, people in the North might have said, that's crazy. You're going to count people that can't vote. But the counter argument would have been, yeah, but you don't get the constant. We want these states to join the union. If we're hard nosed about it, they won't join. We'll have two United States. We'll have the Northern United States and the Southern United States, whatever name they give it. Okay, let's compromise. So that's what they did. Fine. Now they brought up the issue, what if a slave escapes and runs away to a free state? Well, they say, well, they put that in the Constitution. Well, let's look at this. So they put it in there. And it's in the Constitution. You can read it yourself. I could bring it up if somebody challenges me on it, because I never talk about things I can't bring up and back up. In the Constitution, it said, if anybody, I'll just paraphrase it. I don't remember the quote. I could show it to you. If a slave escapes, they didn't use that term. They didn't like to use that term. They never used that term in the Declaration of Independence. They never used that term in the Constitution. They tried to, step around those terms. But what they meant was, if a slave escapes, the owner can make a petition to the U.S. government, say, hey, this guy ran away. Boom, here's my petition. And they would have to be returned to the state and to the person they escaped from. And that would be the responsibility of the U.S. government. I didn't write it. I didn't make the Constitution. It's in the Constitution, okay? Clear as a bell. If a slave escapes, they have to be returned to the owner. And in fact, the South was pressing the U.S. on that issue in the 1850s and saying, you're not enforcing the law. These people are escaping and they're not being returned. Or they would say this property is escaping and not being returned, and that's violating the Constitution. And you cannot openly violate the Constitution, because that would invalidate the document and would mean that the Constitution was void, which of course it would mean. If you don't follow the provisions of a contract, the contract is void. So that's why they passed the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850, which caused a lot of problems. So it was a build up of trouble, you see. And then when you had the abolitionists and the Unitarians, the Unitarians in New England, and radicals like William, what was his name, Garrison, who wrote who made the newspaper, The Crisis, right? Wasn't that his name? And he burned a copy of the Constitution. Why would he burn a copy of the Constitution? Because he said, now this is an abolitionist talking. See, this is not me. You say, well, you're from Louisiana. We know how you people are. Okay, well, he was from New England, and we know how those people are. He burned a copy of the Constitution. Why? He said the Constitution was evil because it guaranteed slavery in the slave states. Okay, and he made the newspaper The Crisis. And in fact, his faction, the abolitionists, were hoping for a war, because they knew that a war would give a much better opportunity to outlaw slavery. That if they had no war between the states, that institution, the peculiar institution, could continue for who knows how long. So William Lloyd Garrison, that was his name. So before you listen to major media these days with all their fanatical posturing, how about learning about the truth? Now, I don't totally pick on Nikki Haley because she doesn't know the answer, because she doesn't know about history. But I would pick on her because she has bad advisors. They should have told her, just say, I don't know. Because I try to do that. If people ask me historical questions or questions about beer or bourbon, I just tell them, I don't know. If I don't know, I'll just say, I don't know, but I'll try to find out. I mean, it's sort of like a pride thing, Pride comes before a fall. And what do you gain from being prideful? I don't see anything. So, and Trump, people picking on Trump for saying that they could have negotiated and prevented the war. He's certainly correct. And in fact, there were many people looking to negotiate, including Lincoln. Of course, when he saw that the negotiations weren't going anywhere, that's when he tried to precipitate the war. and he baited the Confederate States into attacking, and they took the bait. And I was thinking about making a video in the future called "Taking the Bait," and I was going to show so many examples in world history where countries like Great Britain, for example, which is basically who I'm talking about, they set the bait and other people take the bait. And I was gonna talk about that, setting the bait and people taking the bait. Um, you say, well, that kind of happened in 2022, didn't it? In February 2022, they were baited and they did. Yeah, you could say that. You could say that in 1990, 64, 50, 39, 41, 39, 14, 61. So you can go back in time and you can see where these traps were set and people walk into the trap. And so I think people need to be careful not to walk into the trap. But this video is not about walking into traps. It's about really just discussing what I've been hearing on the news about Nikki Haley and Donald Trump and all this claptrap about the war between the states, the so-called Civil War, which it wasn't a civil war. It was a war between American people, yes, but it wasn't a civil war in the classic sense that you have two factions trying to take over the same government, because the southern states had no interest in taking over the U.S. government. Their interest was in leaving the government, much like the revolutionaries, the secessionists in 1775, 76, I might add. All right, now let's look at the comments, and then we're out of here. Do you think people have the brain size of a cat? I am not a scientist, so I cannot answer questions about brain size. Tab says, it's kind of bad if a person who wants to lead a country doesn't know how basic history is, like Nikki. It's bad, but you go back in history and look at how many people were president and didn't know much about history, you'd really think it was bad. Now, I'm not talking about Richard Nixon, who could talk about history for 6 hours straight without notes, which is probably one of the reasons they got rid of him. You know what I mean? Or John Kennedy, all the bad things we could say about him validly, but he did have some grasp of history, at least. He had a beautiful ghost written book. But anyway, you know what I mean. But generally, yeah, these guys, they don't know much about history. Theodore Roosevelt, I mean, he wrote books. I mean, he might have learned about historical allegories at the lodge, you know. But anyway, but I mean, generally, nah, they don't know too much. Now, Trump but he was right. The war could have been prevented through negotiation. So to attack him for that is ridiculous. In fact, you can look at pretty much any war that ever happened in history could have been negotiated, prevented through negotiation, you see. So, but anyway, all right, well, our current president does not even know where he is most of the time. Unfortunately, that seems to be the case. I guess he kind of knows where he is. He has some grasp of, I'm awake, I'm in a room, but he may not know, like, he might say stuff like, I'm still a vice president, right? Like, I think that's what was released today by the independent prosecutor, that they couldn't charge him with a crime because when they were interviewing him, he thought he was still a vice president. So they thought it would look bad in front of a jury that, like, they could never prove that he maliciously kept these top secret documents because he didn't know, he thought he was still the vice president. So that was like on CNN. They were like, this is terrible because they're not charging him with a crime, but they're saying that he's not sure when his son died. He knew his son had died, but he wasn't sure the year, and maybe he wasn't sure of the decade. I don't know. He might have known the decade, but he was very confused. They say he was very confused. So yes, that's a very interesting comment that you make there, William. All right, well, y'all take care now. He should resign. Well, not resign, I guess, but retire. We should resign for other things, but he should just forget it, give it up. We need younger people to be president. People like, well, me, for instance. Would I run for president in 2024? I wouldn't run for president because I got no political support and I have no money. No, I have money to buy beer or some kind of bourbon to review, but I don't have money to run for president. But I mean, I could do a lot better job than these people. I'm not saying that as a prideful statement. I'm saying that because it's the truth. All right, we all take care now, and I would say that, and that would be my slogan: the taxpayer's friend. I would be the taxpayer's friend, and it would be like he knows what's going on. He has some knowledge about general things. All right. Yes, I should be president. You would certainly get my vote, Ron. Thank you, JBD. It's more like an organization than a person. They would get another puppet to take. Well, yeah, that's why I wouldn't be nominated. I'm not a puppet, and I wouldn't be a puppet, and I would definitely not fit the profile. Although I'll do a great job, I agree with that. I would. I'm not saying that. Like I said, I'm not saying that from a point of pride or arrogance. I just know I would do a much better job, and I'm unanimous in that. All right, y'all take care now.